On the wild mountains, a black man lived alone in a worn-out cabin, carrying the silent weight of sorrow. During a routine hike after a fierce storm, he found an injured woman, unconscious, clinging to life. Without hesitation, he stepped forward to save her, even knowing he might be putting himself in danger. What he didn't know was that the woman was a wealthy billionaire, and that his act of kindness would change his life forever. Before we dive in this story, let us know where you're watching from. We love to hear your thoughts. High up in the mountains, where the wind howled like ancient spirits and the sky stretched wide and indifferent, Thomas made his steady ascent. The path was familiar to him. Every rock, every gnarled root underfoot seemed almost like an old friend, but familiarity did not dull the sharp edge of the cold or the loneliness that clung to his heavy boots. Thomas was a man carved from hardship, his dark skin weathered by years of sun and wind, his frame still strong despite the slow, creeping stiffness in his joints. In his early 50s now, he bore the quiet dignity of someone who had endured much and asked little from the world in return. His eyes, dark and deep, held a sadness that never quite left, a wound invisible yet ever present. He lived alone in a small, weather-beaten cabin tucked deep in the folds of the mountains, a place he had shared once with his wife before illness carried her away, leaving only the echo of her laughter in the walls and the lingering scent of wildflowers she used to gather. There had been no children, no family left to call his own, only the mountains and the stubborn rhythm of survival. Each week, without fail, Thomas made this climb not out of pleasure or ambition, but out of a quiet, almost sacred duty. It was a promise, whispered to the woman he loved on the night she died, to keep living, to keep moving, even when the weight of solitude threatened to root him to the earth. The mountains demanded everything: resilience, patience, respect. Thomas gave it willingly, for here, among the towering pines and sheer cliffs, he found a kind of peace that the busy world below could not offer. Here he could breathe without the heavy expectations of society pressing down on him, without the curious stares or the pity that sometimes shadowed his footsteps when he ventured into town. Up here, he was simply a man against the elements, a man who still had purpose. Today, the sky was a stark, cloudless blue, the air sharp enough to bite. Thomas moved with the confidence of long habit, his backpack light, his steps sure, his senses attuned to every whisper of the forest around him. He paused now and then, resting a hand on the rough bark of a tree, or crouching to examine tracks left by a deer or a fox in the soft earth. There was a patience to his movements, a respect for the living world that could not be rushed or bargained with. The climb was not just physical, it was a ritual of remembrance, a conversation with ghosts he dared not let slip away. Every heartbeat, every labored breath as he ascended was a testament to the life he had built, and the life he still carried forward, stubborn and defiant against the slow erosion of time. Alone but not broken, Thomas pressed onward, higher into the embrace of the mountain, unaware that today, unlike all the days before, the wilderness would ask something more of him, a test not of endurance, but of heart. As Thomas rounded a familiar bend, his boots crunching softly against the gravel and moss, a sound broke the solemn stillness. A sharp, desperate cry, thin and ragged, swallowed almost immediately by the roaring wind. He froze, his body tensing instinctively. For a moment he wondered if his mind was playing tricks on him, conjuring phantoms from the loneliness that had settled too deep in his bones. But then it came again, weaker this time, more like a whimper than a scream. Thomas's heart hammered against his ribs. Without hesitation, he shifted the weight of his pack and scanned the dense tree line, the cliffs that loomed over the path, the jagged crevices below. His instincts, honed by years of navigating these wild slopes, tugged at him, drawing him toward a narrow deer trail veering off the main path, half hidden by brambles. Moving quickly now, he pushed through the underbrush, ignoring the sharp sting of branches against his arms. The terrain grew steeper, less forgiving, and the ground underfoot turned treacherous with loose stones. Thomas kept going, driven by something deep and immovable inside him. A few hundred yards down he caught sight of a figure, crumpled, still lying at the bottom of a shallow ravine where the earth had given way into a rocky drop. His breath caught in his throat. From this distance, all he could make out was a tangle of limbs and a mop of dark hair, stark against the pale rocks. Thomas scrambled down the incline, every careful step a calculation between urgency and safety. As he drew closer, the figure sharpened into the form of a young woman, dressed in expensive hiking gear now torn and muddied. Her body was twisted unnaturally, her leg bent at an angle that made Thomas wince. He dropped to his knees beside her, his hands working with surprising steadiness despite the adrenaline coursing through him. Gently, he pressed 2 fingers against her neck, a pulse, weak but there. Relief washed over him, swift and overwhelming, but it was tempered immediately by the grim reality. She was unconscious, injured, and in no condition to move on her own. Thomas pulled out his old flip phone, already knowing what he would see. No signal. The nearest ranger station was miles away, and the storm clouds massing at the horizon threatened to make the journey even more perilous. For a moment, doubt gnawed at him. He was no doctor. He was a man who had taught himself to endure, not to heal, but abandoning her was never an option. That wasn't the kind of man he was. That wasn't the kind of man his wife had loved. Moving with careful urgency, Thomas assessed her injuries. Severe but survivable if he acted quickly. Her right leg was clearly broken and a nasty gash bled sluggishly along her temple. He shed his pack and got to work, tearing strips from his own shirt to bind her head wound, fashioning a makeshift splint from straight branches and the paracord he always carried. His hands worked by memory, by instinct, by the sheer necessity of saving a life. Every moment he lingered was a moment closer to disaster. The cold was already seeping into the ground, into her still body. Hoisting her onto a crude stretcher built from branches and his own battered jacket, Thomas braced himself for the journey ahead. The trail back to his cabin was rough and winding, a good 3 miles even without the burden of carrying an unconscious woman. The sky had begun to darken ominously, the air thick with the metallic scent of impending rain. Every step would be a battle against exhaustion, against pain, against the whispered doubts that he was too old, too worn to finish what he had started. Still, Thomas tightened the straps of the makeshift litter, set his shoulders against the weight, and began the long, grueling trek back up the mountain. Each footfall was deliberate, each breath drawn through clenched teeth. His muscles screamed in protest as he navigated slick stones and narrow ledges, the woman's fragile weight a constant reminder of the responsibility he had chosen to bear. The wind picked up, cold fingers clawing at his clothes, but Thomas did not falter. He moved with a stubborn kind of grace, a man unwilling to let death steal one more person from under his watch. The mountain demanded everything from him, but Thomas gave it freely, dragging hope up the cliffs one agonizing step at a time, unaware that this single act of mercy was about to change the course of his life forever. The storm broke over the mountains with a savage roar, lashing rain against the cliffs and trees with a kind of ferocity Thomas had not seen in years. Shielding his face with his shoulder, he fought his way up the trail, dragging the makeshift stretcher behind him with grim determination. Mud clung to his boots, pulling at every step, the ground turning slick and treacherous. The young woman remained unconscious, her body jolting slightly with every bump and slip, but Thomas dared not stop. The temperature was dropping fast, and the wind was turning colder with each passing minute. If he didn't reach shelter soon, it wouldn't matter how hard he fought, the mountain would claim her anyway. Every muscle in his body screamed, every breath burned his chest, but he pressed on, refusing to surrender to the fatigue gnawing at his bones. He spoke to her sometimes, low and steady over the howl of the wind, as much to keep himself going as to offer her some tether to life. "Stay with me, girl," he muttered between gritted teeth. "Almost there, you just hold on." By the time the old hunting cabin came into view through the mist and rain, Thomas was running on little more than stubbornness and sheer force of will. He stumbled across the threshold, pulling the stretcher inside and slamming the door shut against the storm's fury. The cabin shuddered, but it held. It always did. Moving quickly but carefully, Thomas cleared a space by the cold fireplace and lowered the stretcher onto the floor. His hands, though numb from cold and exhaustion, worked with steady purpose. He knew enough about first aid to handle the basics, stabilizing injuries, preventing shock, buying time. That was all he could do here. He fished out his battered emergency kit from the corner where he kept it and set to work, murmuring reassurances under his breath even though she was still too far gone to hear. He did not remove her clothes, only checked for visible wounds that needed urgent attention. Her jacket was torn along one side, blood darkening the fabric at her thigh and temple, but there was no time, and no need, for anything more invasive. Thomas used clean gauze to press gently against the gash on her forehead, wrapping a makeshift bandage around her head to slow the bleeding. He reinforced the splint he had hastily built on the trail, checking her leg to ensure it was secured without causing more harm. His touch was firm but respectful, the way a man raised to understand dignity and decency would treat a vulnerable stranger. Once he had done all he could, Thomas propped her up slightly, using rolled-up blankets, and positioned her close to the fireplace. He worked methodically to build a fire from the dry kindling he kept stored in oilcloth, coaxing the reluctant flames to life until the cabin was filled with the precious warmth of crackling wood. He grabbed his own heavy coat from a hook near the door and laid it carefully over her, layering extra blankets around her body to conserve every ounce of heat. Outside, the storm raged on, hammering against the cabin's battered walls, but inside there was a fragile pocket of safety, a small island of hope carved out by stubborn hands. Thomas crouched by the fire, his legs stiff, his clothes still damp from rain and sweat. He watched her intently, every rise and fall of her chest a reassurance against the gnawing fear that he had been too late. Hours crawled by, the storm growing and then gradually easing as dawn threatened to seep into the gray sky. Thomas stayed awake, his body screaming for rest, but he would not allow himself to sleep. He kept the fire fed, adjusted the blankets when they slipped, listened to the labored rhythm of her breathing. Outside these walls, the world could rage and roar all it wanted. In here, he would hold the line. He had not asked for this, had not sought it out, but now that it had been laid at his feet, he would see it through, because that's what a man did. Because some promises, the ones made to no one but yourself, mattered more than anything else. And so Thomas sat through the long, brutal night, his tired eyes fixed on the fragile thread of life he had pulled back from the mountain's hungry jaws, determined not to let it slip away. Morning edged into the cabin like a cautious guest, the faint gray light of dawn seeping through the cracks in the weathered boards. Thomas, stiff from hours spent vigilantly watching over her, barely noticed the creeping cold against his skin anymore. His gaze remained fixed on the young woman lying bundled in blankets by the fire, her breathing shallow but steady. When she stirred, it was only a faint twitch at first, a soft sound like a broken sigh escaping her lips. Thomas leaned in, cautious, his every movement careful not to startle her. Her eyelids fluttered open, confusion clouding the vivid green of her gaze, and for a moment she looked at him not with fear, but with raw, aching bewilderment. "You're safe," Thomas said quietly, his voice low and even, the same tone one might use to soothe a skittish animal. "You're hurt, but you're safe. I'm Thomas. Found you out there." She blinked at him, struggling to focus, her face tightening with pain. After a long pause, she whispered, "My leg." Her words were cracked and dry, barely audible. Thomas nodded. "Broken, most likely. I did what I could. Help's coming." He offered her a battered tin cup of water, steadying her gently as she sipped with trembling hands. When the helicopter came, hours later, its blades shattering the mountain's silence, Thomas stood in the clearing, waving them down, his coat whipping around him in the downdraft. Rescue workers flooded the cabin, assessing her quickly, bundling her into a real stretcher this time, working with clinical efficiency. As they lifted her into the helicopter, her hand reached out feebly, her fingers brushing the air, searching. Thomas caught the gesture, stepped forward just far enough for their eyes to meet. He tipped his hat, a silent acknowledgement, a farewell wrapped in gratitude, and something deeper neither could name. Then she was gone, carried away into the vast sky, back to a world Thomas had never belonged to. He thought that would be the end of it. The mountains held their breath in the stillness that followed the last winter storm. Snow had begun to recede, uncovering the battered earth and the stubborn green shoots that refused to be buried forever. Thomas moved through the thawing forest with the steady rhythm that had come to define his life, mending fences, clearing the narrow trails, patching the leaks the snowmelt had opened in the roof of his cabin. A week had passed since the storm and the rescue, and though he thought of her sometimes, the girl with the green eyes and the broken leg, he had no expectation of hearing her name again. That was how it always was with the mountain. People came, people went. It endured. It was on one of those slow afternoons, when the clouds hung low and the river sang with the urgency of new water, that Thomas heard the unfamiliar rumble of tires on the narrow dirt track leading to his clearing. He set down his axe and watched, wary but calm, as a single dark SUV made its careful way up the road, stopping a few yards from the porch. The doors opened and two people emerged, a driver, tall and stiff in a suit, and then her. Amelia Grant. She was seated in a wheelchair, her leg in a heavy cast, her face pale and framed by a thick scarf against the lingering cold. But her eyes, sharp, steady, alive, found him instantly. Thomas crossed his arms over his chest, his expression unreadable, waiting. He was a man who did not leap to conclusions, a man who waited for the truth to present itself in its own time. The driver pushed her forward, but Amelia lifted a hand and he stepped back, allowing her to wheel herself the last few feet until she came to a stop at the base of Thomas's porch. There was a long moment of silence, filled only by the soft crackling of melting snow and the far-off call of a raven. "I needed to come back," Amelia said, her voice low but clear. "I needed to thank you properly, face to face." Amelia smiled faintly, as if she understood. "My name is Amelia Grant," she continued, "and you probably don't know me, but I'm the CEO of the Grant Group. I own a few companies and a few buildings and apparently some mountains, too." She laughed softly, a sound that didn't quite reach her eyes. "But when I fell out here, none of that mattered. I was just a woman who would have died if you hadn't come." Thomas shifted his weight slightly, the faintest flicker of something, surprise, maybe humility, passing through his steady eyes. "I owe you my life," Amelia said, her voice softening. "And while I know you didn't do it expecting anything, I still want to thank you the right way." She pulled a thick envelope from the bag resting across her lap and extended it toward him. Thomas hesitated only for a moment before stepping forward and taking it, his rough fingers brushing the paper gently, as if reluctant to disturb its weight. Inside were plans. Clear, carefully drawn plans, a new house to replace his aging cabin. Strong, simple, beautiful in its humility, built to withstand the mountain, but still one with it. No glass towers, no marble floors, just timber and stone, the way the land intended. But the letter held more than blueprints. Amelia's voice, quiet but unwavering, filled the space between them. "I'm building a survival center a few miles down the trail, a place where people can learn what it means to live with the land, not against it. And I'd like you to be part of it, Mr. Walker. I want you to teach, to guide." Thomas blinked. Not in disbelief, but as if absorbing something that felt too large to hold all at once. "And there's one more thing," she added, her hands folding neatly in her lap. "I've started a fund, in your name, the Thomas Walker Foundation. It'll support mountain rescue teams, conservation programs, and survival training for kids who've never had the chance to stand on ground like this." For a long moment Thomas said nothing. The wind tugged at the loose strands of Amelia's hair, carrying the scent of pine and river water between them. He lowered the envelope slowly, his thumb resting against the seam as if grounding himself. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, steady, touched by something almost fragile. "I never did it thinking I'd get something back." "I know," Amelia said, smiling, and for the first time there was a shine in her eyes that spoke of something deeper than gratitude. Thomas shifted again, the hint of a smile beginning to soften the lines of his weathered face. He took a deep breath, filling his lungs with the cool mountain air, then looked out across the woods as if seeking counsel from the hills themselves. When he spoke again, his words were slow, thoughtful. "You don't owe me anything," he said. "But if there's good that can come from it, if this place can teach folks to respect it, not just survive it." He paused, glancing down at the folder in his hand, then back at her with a quiet warmth. "Then I reckon we can call it even." Amelia laughed. A light sound carried on the breeze, and Thomas chuckled softly in return. A sound rare and rough-edged, but genuine. The weeks that followed were filled with the quiet, steady sound of renewal. Craftsmen came, not with noise and bluster, but with hands skilled in the old ways, raising thick beams and laying stone with the reverence of people who understood they were not conquering the mountain, but becoming a part of it. The new cabin rose where the old one had stood, stronger, warmer, but still bearing the soul of the place Thomas had called home for so long. Down the trail the wilderness center took shape. A modest lodge tucked into the trees, with open windows that breathed with the forest, and sturdy porches where visitors could gather to listen and learn. Thomas spent his days there now, guiding small groups along narrow trails, teaching them to read the signs of the land. The curl of moss on a tree trunk, the way the wind spoke before a storm, the tracks of deer woven through the brush. The Thomas Walker Fund quietly began its work, supporting mountain rescue teams, opening scholarships for inner-city youth to come and learn from the mountain itself. No fanfare, no news crews, just quiet, lasting change, born from an act of kindness that had never asked for repayment. And Thomas? He remained where he belonged. He rose with the sun each morning, walked the ridge lines as mist curled around his boots, felt the earth steady beneath his feet. Visitors came and went, but the mountain stayed, his home stayed, his heart stayed. Sometimes, when the first stars pricked through the velvet sky and the fire crackled low in his hearth, Thomas would sit on his porch, feeling the living pulse of the land stretch out around him, and he would think, softly, humbly, about how life, against all odds, had found a way to give something back. And for the first time in a long time, Thomas Walker smiled and meant it. He was not just surviving anymore. He was home. Join us to share meaningful stories by hitting the like and subscribe buttons. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell to start your day with profound lessons and heartfelt empathy.